Imagine sitting in a 19th century Indian courtyard. The afternoon air is thick and warm, and you find yourself just listening in on this high stakes, honestly intensely spicy debate between two very different men.
Oh, to be a fly on the wall for that one.
Right. So on one side, you have a saffron-clad Shudra Sadhu. He is a traditional hermit from the Kabir Bhakti sect wearing a simple necklace of basil leaves. And, I mean, the Kabir sect is known for being somewhat more egalitarian than mainstream traditions, but this sadhu is still deeply, deeply rooted in his religious worldview.
Yeah, he has his traditional foundation.
Exactly. And on the other side sits Jotirao Phule. He's this radical thinker and reformer who has just finished drafting a searing text titled Cultivator's Whipcord.
It is genuinely the perfect historical setup for a collision of worldviews. I mean, you are watching traditional religious doctrine walk right into a buzzsaw of sharp, unyielding sociological critique. Phule isn't, he's not just trying to win an argument here. He is systematically dissecting the actual anatomy of power.
And what unfolds isn't just a theological debate. It is a literal blueprint for how powerful people use distraction, luxury, and, manufactured bureaucracy to keep the rest of us completely locked out of the rooms where decisions are made.
Which is so relevant.
It really is. And that is the core of our deep dive today. We are unpacking a translated historical dialogue between these two figures. We're going to examine exactly how Phule deconstructs the idea of divine exclusivity, how he exposes the political manipulation of 19th century court advisors, and, well, how he champions education as the only real tool for liberation.
And, to be clear from the jump, we are looking at this text as an artifact of historical logic. The theological claims, the sharp political critiques, they belong to the 19th century.
Right. Our goal is to impartially report on this.
Exactly. We want to neutrally map out the architecture of Phule's argument. We want to see how he takes this massive abstract concept like divine will and slowly, methodically drags it down into the mud of a farmer's field, just to reveal the human machinery operating behind the curtain.
So the conversation kicks off with the sadhu essentially calling Phule out. I mean, the sadhu has sought him out specifically to question his recent very public criticisms of Hinduism.
He wants answers.
He does. He wants to know why Phule doubts the divine origin of the four principal Vedas. Because for the sadhu, the premise is simple and absolute. The Vedas are divine revelations. He believes God composed these texts with the commendable, universal object of redeeming and saving the entirety of mankind.
And this is where it gets brilliant, because Phule doesn't attack the idea of God directly. Instead, he uses this masterful Socratic method. He actually accepts the sadhu's premise, but just to trap him in it.
So it's a total logic trap.
It is. He asks, okay, if God is truly omniscient, and if this divine creator composed these texts to save all of humanity, meaning people across all four continents and the various remote islands of the globe, what language did this God choose to use?
And well, the sadhu gives the only answer his tradition allows, which is Sanskrit.
Which is the exact opening Phule is waiting for. He immediately points out the glaring logistical contradiction there. If you have an all-knowing God whose stated goal is the universal salvation of every single human being, why would that God encode the ultimate key to salvation in a language that a tiny microscopic fraction of the global population actually understands?
It just doesn't make sense. And the sadhu kind of scrambles to patch the hole in his logic. He suggests that perhaps at the very dawn of creation, everyone on Earth actually did speak Sanskrit.
Right, like a universal language.
Yeah, in his view, it was the original universal medium of communication, and diverse languages simply fractured and evolved over time as people spread out across the globe.
I mean, that defense might work if you're talking about a human author, but Phule reminds the sadhu that they are supposedly talking about an omniscient deity. He counters by asking, wait, wouldn't an all-knowing, omnipresent God foresee the evolution of diverse languages?
You would think so.
Right. Why would a divine creator be blindsided by human linguistic drift? If God didn't see that coming and didn't plan for it by providing translations or a truly universal medium, well, that severely undercuts the whole claim of divine omniscience.
And Phule drives this point home with this really interesting anecdote about a famous European scholar, Max Muller. Muller was incredibly well-versed in the four Vedas. He knew Sanskrit intimately, perhaps better than a lot of traditional priests.
He was a true expert.
He was. Yet Muller didn't convert to the Vedic religion. He even went so far as to condemn his own religion of Christianity, so it showed he wasn't afraid to break from tradition at all. Phule basically asks a sadhu if this text is the undeniable divine key to salvation, and the language barrier is the only thing stopping people. Why didn't the scholar who perfectly understood the language convert?
And the sadhu gets incredibly defensive here. His response is honestly quite revealing about how insulated his worldview is. He guesses that perhaps Max Mueller just couldn't handle the cold European climate while wearing a traditional sacred thread and, bathing 3 times a day.
Wait, he blames the weather.
He literally blames the weather. He genuinely suggests that the physical rituals were just too much for the cold climate, completely sidestepping the intellectual or theological implications of Mueller's rejection.
That is wild. Think about a modern equivalent of what Phule is pointing out for a second. It is, it's like a massive tech company releasing a supposedly universal, life-saving software, something designed to cure a global disease.
Okay, I like this analogy.
But they only code the instruction manual in an incredibly obscure, dead programming language that 99.9% of the world doesn't know. And then when people can't use the software, the company blames the users for not being able to read the manual. If the stated goal is universal access, the method of delivery completely contradicts the mission.
Exactly. Phule is demonstrating that linguistic exclusivity is the very first barrier to knowledge, and he is using pure logic to question the divine justification for it. He is planting a seed in the sadhu's mind. If the language itself is a barrier, then the claim of universal salvation is a facade.
And if it's a facade, someone else must be benefiting from it.
Precisely.
But if language was just the first lock on the door, who is actually turning the key? Because God isn't the one enforcing this on the ground, right? Humans are. Which brings us to the actual physical ban on marginalized people reading these texts.
Right, the human element of the gatekeeping.
Yeah, Phule shifts the focus from the divine to the human administrators of this religion. He asks the sadhu, if God meant this knowledge for everyone, why are Shudras and Ati-Shudras, the lower tiers, and the outcasts of the traditional social hierarchy, explicitly forbidden from studying these texts?
It is a sharp escalation. Phule is essentially asking why God would turn a blind eye to Brahmins, the priestly and administrative class, actively banning marginalized people from the very texts meant to save them. He pushes the sadhu to justify why these marginalized groups should even call themselves Hindus or believe in this specific almighty if they're forced to suffer such an unjustifiable exclusionary ban.
And the sadhu's defense is almost hard to believe, but it highlights this massive blind spot he has. He claims there is no coordinated ban. He frames the entire situation as, well, basic economics.
The poverty excuse.
Exactly. He points out that Brahmin scholars routinely teach the Vedas to Christian padres for money. They do it to earn a livelihood. So according to the sadhu, the Shudras and Ati-Shudras aren't being systematically oppressed. They're simply too poor to pay the tutoring fees. He actually asks Phule, how can you blame the Brahmins for this state of affairs?
He views it entirely as a fee-for-service transaction. In the sadhu's mind, if you have the money, you get the knowledge. If you don't, you don't. He divorces the religious text entirely from its social function, treating it like a luxury commodity rather than a divine right.
Hold on, I really have to push back on the sadhu's logic here on behalf of the listener, because Phule does the exact same thing in the text. If this is purely a transactional issue of who can afford the tuition, what about the incredibly wealthy Shudra princes?
Ah, yes, the royal courts.
Right. We are talking about the actual rulers of the Indian states during this period. They aren't poor villagers. They have massive royal treasuries. If money was the only barrier, these princes should be the most educated Vedic scholars in the land.
And you're hitting on the exact realization Phule uses to completely dismantle the sadhu's worldview. Phule realizes in this moment that the sadhu is deeply, deeply naive. The hermit is entirely ignorant of what Phule terms the craftiness of the Brahmins.
The craftiness, I like that word.
By conflating systemic oppression with personal poverty, the sadhu has completely missed the deliberate, highly organized gatekeeping happening at the absolute highest levels of royal society.
So Phule pivots directly to those wealthy Shudra rulers to prove his point. He zeroes in on the royal courts of the Bonsals, the Scindias, the Holkars, and the Gaikwads, and he just paints this picture of staggering extravagance for the sadhu.
The wealth was astronomical.
It really was. These princes are wealthy enough to shower their Brahmin advisors with immense gifts. We aren't just talking about a few gold coins here. We are talking about jagirs, which are entire revenue-generating principalities.
The scale of the wealth transfer is immense. Phule notes they lavish these advisors with circular golden trinkets in Pune. He brings up one prince who feeds Mendic Brahmins the choicest victuals. specifically mentioning a month's supply of bundi latas at places of pilgrimage. The wealth is just flowing freely from the Shudra rulers to the Brahmin class.
Yet, amidst all this unimaginable wealth being handed out, Phule points out a glaring, intentional omission. Not a single Brahmin beneficiary, none of the advisors, none of the priests receiving these entire principalities, ever uses his influence to persuade these princes to open primary schools for the Shudra children in the surrounding villages.
Not one.
Not a single one.
And the sadhu is still struggling to grasp the systemic nature of this. He thinks in terms of individual action, so he asks a very practical, if somewhat naive, question. He tells Phule, look, if the princes have all this money and they're giving it away, why don't you just go and petition them directly?
It seems logical on the surface.
Right. He cites a concrete example of a man named Kusha Gongade. Gongade was a folk play singer who played stringed instruments. The sadhu points out that this entertainer easily got an audience in Baroda and walked away with thousands of rupees. So he's like, why can't a social worker like Phule get an audience to ask for a school?
But Phule's answer lays bare the absolute genius of the political trap. He explains that the courts are entirely guarded by Brahmin officers. A folk singer gets an audience because he serves a specific purpose, but a social worker asking for schools. They would never make it past the front gate.
They're completely blocked.
Completely. The advisors purposefully addict the prices to song, dance, folk plays, and these grand, exhausting banquets held in honor of visiting English dignitaries.
It is the ultimate gatekeeping of attention. By keeping the princes perpetually entertained, the advisors ensure the rulers never have the time, the inclination, or the focus to govern effectively or look into the welfare of their subjects.
Think about how this works in a modern bureaucratic setting. It's the ultimate form of toxic managing upwards. Imagine a group of middle managers who want to run a company entirely for their own benefit, without any oversight from the CEO.
Oh, this happens all the time.
Right. How do they do it? They keep the CEO permanently distracted with expensive corporate retreats, endless golf trips, and lavish industry parties. As long as the boss is having a great time and feeling important, the middle managers hold the actual reins of the company. They feather their own nests and block anyone from bringing real operational issues to the boss's attention.
The political analysis here is devastatingly sharp. Phule is showing that the lack of education among the masses isn't just an unfortunate side effect of poverty. It is a manufactured, highly protected condition necessary to maintain political dominance. Yeah. By blocking what Phule beautifully calls the healing balm of education, the advisors consolidate all administrative power within their own caste. If the prince is distracted, the advisor rules.
And once the mechanics of this court distraction are laid out so clearly, the sadhu finally breaks. He has this massive realization. He actually admits he never dreamt these religious and administrative leaders were capable of such calculated stratagems. He sees that it has nothing to do with divine will and everything to do with earthly power.
And Phule twists the knife by revealing just how far these advisors will go to maintain that power. He explains that when the young Shudra princes come of age, the Brahmin court officers actively undermine them to the colonial powers.
Wait, really?
Yes. They write unsolicited secret letters to the British government claiming that the young princes are incompetent, uneducated, and entirely incapable of shouldering administrative responsibilities.
I mean, they're committing borderline treason against their own rulers.
Essentially, yes.
They parade the princes in front of the English by day to show off their royal status, and then distract them with notch boys and concerts by night, ensuring they actually do look incompetent.
They engineer the incompetence, report it to the British, and then position themselves as the only reliable administrators capable of running the state. They leverage the colonial presence to cement their own indispensable status.
But, I mean, why go through all this exhausting trouble? Why build this massive labyrinth of distraction and betrayal just to block a few primary schools? Here's where Phule delivers the ultimate reveal, dragging the entire argument from the divine heavens right down into the mud.
The actual literal mud.
Yes, he exposes the core fear driving every single one of these political maneuvers.
Phule explains that if Shudra farmers get educated, they will naturally realize their own potential and rise to high, responsible government positions based on merit. And if that happens, the children of the current Brahmin officers would be displaced from their comfortable administrative roles.
And what happens to them if they lose those cushy desk jobs? Phule says they would be forced to undertake hard, dull, and onerous agricultural work. They would have to push the plow.
Which is their worst nightmare.
Exactly. They would have to take their tender, uncalloused hands and soil them with the mud and mire of the fields.
It all boils down to a profound generational fear of manual labor. The preservation of their elevated status and physical comfort absolutely requires the intellectual suppression of the farming class. If the farmer learns to read, the administrator might have to learn to farm.
To prove that this systemic suppression is a choice and not just some law of nature, Phule contrasts the internal corruption of the royal courts with the actions of foreigners, specifically Christian missionaries. He points out that while the wealthy princes are distracted, the missionaries are actively collecting donations from their own countrymen back in Europe just to open schools in these Indian states.
Right, Phule highlights the tangible success of these alternative paths. These missionary schools work. They are producing Shudra scholars who are, in every intellectual metric, the absolute equals of the Brahmin scholars.
They are proving the system wrong.
Exactly. These newly educated Shudras are passing exams, entering the administration, and occupying high stations as advocates and government officers alongside the traditional elites.
But this introduces a really dark, fascinating complication into Phule's text. Based on everything we just said, you would think he would be thrilled. I mean, the system is finally being bypassed, the marginalized are getting educated, and they are taking seats at the table.
You would assume it's a happy ending.
Right. But immediately after pointing out this success, Phule describes these newly successful educated Shudras as accursed and undiscerning. Why would he use such harsh language for people who have achieved exactly the liberation he is advocating for?
Because Phule is a realist, and he recognizes the insidious nature of internalized oppression. This is where the text moves from political critique to a deep psychological tragedy. He observes that when these educated Shudras finally break through the barrier and achieve high status, they often become entirely lost in their own conceit.
The sudden influx of wealth and respect just changes them.
It changes them completely.
They become terrified of losing it. They finally have a taste of the luxury that was denied to them for generations. Phule calls it empty pomp and ceremonial stance.
Precisely. The tragedy is that instead of looking back and using their newfound administrative power to dismantle these systemic trammels holding their communities back, they pull the ladder up behind themselves.
Oh, that is so frustrating.
It is. To protect their new, fragile status, they servilely genuflect to the established Brahmin officers. They mimic the behavior of their former oppressors. They curry favor, adopt the exclusionary attitudes of the elite, and basically become a new layer of the very system that previously kept them in the mud.
They trade solidarity for empty pomp. It is a devastating observation about human nature. It shows that Phule isn't just romanticizing education as a magical cure-all. He deeply understands the corrupting, isolating influence of power and luxury once it is finally attained by those who have been starved of it.
It really completes the architecture of his argument. The system is maintained, first, by claiming divine exclusivity of language, second, by hiding behind the excuse of poverty, third, by politically distracting the leadership, and finally, by co-opting anyone who manages to slip through the cracks.
So as we step back and look at the entire scope of this translated dialogue, the journey Phule takes a listener on is just incredible. We started literally in the clouds, debating the divine origin of an ancient religious text and the omniscience of God. Slowly, layer by layer, Phule peeled back the theology to reveal the economics.
Right, the tuition fees.
Exactly. And he peeled back the economics to reveal the political maneuvering in the royal courts.
And then he peeled back the political maneuvering to reveal the raw human fear of physical labor, the dread of the mud and the mire. He demonstrates with surgical precision that keeping a language exclusive or denying a primary school isn't about God's will. It is about making sure only certain people get to draft the laws, while ensuring a massive, uneducated underclass is forced to push the plow.
It is a masterclass in tracking the mechanics of inequality. He pulls back the curtain on how gatekeeping operates, showing it is rarely about who simply lacks money, but rather who actively controls the distractions, who controls the access to knowledge, and who writes the rules of the bureaucracy.
The dialogue between Phule and the Sadhu might be rooted in the 19th century, but the mechanics of power they are discussing are entirely timeless.
They really are. Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought that builds directly on Phule's brilliant critique of those distracted royal courts. Today, in our own modern societies, in our workplaces, and in our political systems, how often is entertainment, luxury, or empty pomp still deployed by those holding systemic power to keep us thoroughly distracted?
It's a great question.
How often are we handed the equivalent of a folk singer, or a grand banquet to keep us from demanding actual equity, transparent education, and access to the rooms where the real structural decisions are made. Think about that the next time you find yourself endlessly, comfortably scrolling on your screen instead of looking up to see who actually holds the reins.